This moment of group silence to go ahead and get us started here. So welcome everyone today to this special panel event in honor of Professor Orlando Patterson and his new book, Paradox of Freedom. It's really wonderful to see you all here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Deirdre Bloome. I'm the Peter and Isabel Malkin Professor of Public Policy here at HKS and Professor of Sociology over in the FAS, and I'm the director of the Stone Program in Wealth Distribution, Inequality, and Social Policy. That's the name of the program. And I'm really delighted to introduce this event on behalf of the Stone Program, but I'm particularly pleased to introduce this event personally because of how much I've learned from Orlando and his work over the years. So I'm just going to take 30 seconds to say something on that point. When I first met Orlando, I really was unsure about how to handle the situation. I was a first-year graduate student, and Orlando was teaching a class on qualitative methods. So here I was facing an intellectual giant, somebody whose name I only knew from books, and I was there to learn about qualitative methods. It was a subject that I knew nothing about. And today, I'm a quantitative scholar, so not all of the lessons from that class left over in imprint, but I have taken with me many, many lessons that I've learned from Orlando and his work over the years. So a few of those are about how to think about the past really rigorously and how it relates to the present, not only through the persistence of the past to the present, but also through change over time. And then also lessons about how to tackle really big fundamental problems about the social world in ways that take seriously how individual people think about their own lives, as well as the broader situation that they find themselves in. So it's just really my pleasure to introduce this event today together with my colleague, Chris Muller. So now what I'm going to do is just give you a sense of how this event will run and introduce our distinguished panelists for today. So Chris will begin by offering a little bit of insight into Orlando's life and work and into the book that we'll be talking about today. And Chris is professor of sociology here at Harvard. He studies the political economy of incarceration in the United States from Reconstruction to the present. And his work focuses on the long-term evolution of Black and white incarceration rates, with a particular emphasis on how incarceration is related to slavery, peonage, and broader shifts in the agricultural economy in the United States. And then the first panelist to speak after Chris offers some more introductory remarks will be Adom Getachew. And Adom is professor of political science and race, diaspora, and indigeneity at the University of Chicago. So she's a political theorist with research interests in the history of political thought, theories of race and empire, and post-colonial political theory. She's the author of the 2019 book, World Making After Empire, and her second book in progress is about Garveyism, which is the Black nationalist and Pan-African movement that had its height in the 1920s. Aziz Rana will be the second panelist to speak. Aziz is the J. Donald Monahan S.J. University Professor of Law and Government at Boston College Law School. And his work centers on American constitutional law and political development, with a particular focus on how the shifting notions of race, citizenship, and empire have shaped legal and political identity since the country's founding. His most recent book was published in 2024, and it's titled The Constitutional Bind: How Americans Came to Idolize a Document That Fails Them. Our third speaker after Aziz will be Alex Gourevitch. Alex is professor of political science at Brown University. And his first book, which was titled From Slavery to Cooperative Commonwealth, shows how the 19th century critiques of slavery develop into a critique of wage labor and a defense of an economy based on producer cooperatives. He's currently writing 2 more books, one on strikes and one about freedom. After these 3 panelists have spoken, Orlando Patterson will offer some response to these remarks. So Orlando, as you all know, is one of the preeminent intellectual forces of the last half century. He is the John Cowles Professor of Sociology here at Harvard. He's the author of many landmark works of scholarship, including the classic 1982 book, Slavery and Social Death, and the also classic 1991 book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, and that was the winner of the National Book Award for nonfiction in that year. So After all three panelists have spoken and we've heard Orlando's responses, we'll open it up to some Q&A. And at that time, I'll ask you to please come to one of these two mics that you see in these middle aisles of the room so that everybody can hear your questions and so that we can capture the questions also for the video recording we're doing for history, important for Orlando's work. We've got to keep this for history. So I'm going to turn it over now to Chris, who's going to share some insights into Orlando's life and work and the book under discussion for today. But as I do so, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists for their contribution today, and I'd also like to thank our outstanding program coordinator, Matt Lavalle, who's standing in the back there, for all of his great work mounting this event. So thank you to Matt, and welcome to Chris.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Deirdre. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks to the panelists, and I want to reiterate Deirdre's thanks to Matt for his brilliant work in organizing this event. It's a great pleasure to participate in this celebration of the life and work of my colleague and friend, Orlando Patterson. We are here today to mark the publication of the biographical interview conducted with Orlando by the Columbia anthropologist David Scott, titled The Paradox of Freedom. My job today is simply to say a few brief words about the book to set the stage. Scott's original interviews with Orlando were conducted in 2010 and 2011 and published in the journal Small Acts in 2013. I was a student of Orlando's at the time, and I remember devouring the interview in one sitting. Over the years, I've pressed it on anyone who would listen, and one of those people was my Berkeley colleague, the sociologist Loïc Vacant. In 2020, on one of our Sunday walks in Berkeley, I insisted to Loïc that he read the interview, and telling him that he wouldn't be able to put it down. I woke the next morning to find an email from Loïc, sure enough, time-stamped 1:45 a.m., reading, "This should be the basis for a book." Loïc got to work, Scott did another round of interviews, and the result is the book you see before you, published by Polity late last year. The Paradox of Freedom follows Orlando from his childhood in Jamaica to his current post as John Coles Professor of Sociology here at Harvard University. The book is full of incredible stories from Orlando's extraordinary life. On just the third page of the interview, we learn that Orlando's father, who worked on the Jamaican police force, was assigned to tail Marcus Garvey when he was deported back to Jamaica and was radicalized by Garvey's speeches. In his studies at the University College of the West Indies, Orlando did a study of resident hall life with his fellow student, Walter Rodney, the historian and activist. Later, when Orlando and Rodney continued their studies in London, they were summoned to the flat of the towering historian and activist C.L.R. James to study Marx at the great man's feet. When Orlando shared his first novel, The Children of Sisyphus, with James, James secretly found him a publisher, and after the book came out, wrote a glowing review in the New Left Review, whose editorial committee Orlando had just joined. We follow Orlando back to his alma mater and then to a sabbatical leave in Cambridge, Massachusetts, extended by Talcott Parsons, that led to Orlando's tenured position here at Harvard. But Orlando never abandoned Jamaica, and over the years, he's traveled regularly to the island, originally to serve as special advisor for social policy and development to the Democratic Socialist Prime Minister Michael Manley, and most recently as the chair of the Jamaica Education Transformation Commission. Most importantly, the book traces the evolution of Orlando's thought over his incredible career, allowing us to see through lines in his expansive body of work. His insistence on both the destructive consequences of slavery and the origin in the minds and experiences of the enslaved of the idea of freedom as the supreme human value. His rejection of essentialism and parochialism, his devotion to recovering the lived experience of the oppressed in all its complexity, his commitment to the indispensability of history, and his dedication to going against the grain. "I hate conforming," as he put it at one point in the interview. Most clearly, we see the centrality of Jamaica to the thought of this universalist thinker. The political scientist James Scott once described the trajectory of his own research as peasants in Malaysia, peasants everywhere, everyone everywhere. You could say the same thing about Orlando's career, running as it does from slavery in Jamaica to freedom across the globe. For these reasons, I think The Paradox of Freedom is the best single-volume introduction to Orlando's work currently in print. So to close, I'd like to quote from the man himself in response to a question from Scott about what he wants his work to do. Here is Orlando. I want my work to enlighten some of the big issues of our time, such as freedom, democracy, and equality. I want to help my readers come to terms with the great evils of human history, such as genocide, slavery, colonialism, racism, classism, and colorism. I want people to be honest about the ways the past works in accounting for present outcomes, especially the tragic ways in which the historically oppressed become entrapped in their own oppression. In broader terms, I want people, especially in my discipline and in related ones like anthropology, to take history and culture seriously again. I am as puzzled by persistence as I am by change, and I strongly believe that we cannot come to terms with the latter, cannot bend history to our will, until we understand how the mechanisms of persistence prevent change that we want. I want to promote understanding of development and to engage with change. And in regard to my own little part of the world, Jamaica, I want so badly to see the burden of its horrendous past lifted, to relieve the still shocking levels of poverty, to see a reduction of the ghastly scourge of violence, to see the education system work, since it is the main path toward any type of real progress. As we'll see, many of these topics are being taken up by a new generation of scholars, 3 of whom appear on our panel tonight. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our first panelist, Adom Getachew. Thanks.
Okay. Great. All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure. Am I using this mic or? Okay. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. For the panelists, we've been in conversation about this since the spring, so it's lovely to finally be able to be here and to celebrate this wonderful book. So as Chris has just noted, this book expands on an initial set of interviews David Scott conducted with Orlando Patterson, which were first published in the journal Small Acts in 2013. Extended to cover Patterson's work for the last decade and including a new introduction by Scott, this book gives us a comprehensive sense of Patterson's intellectual itinerary. It makes clear the breadth of his preoccupations. I think even those who feel like they know Patterson's work very well will learn something new and fresh from this biographical interview. But in addition to chronicling his wide-ranging scholarly output, it also gives us a sense of the recurring, persistent questions that have shaped that work. We get a better sense of how a diverse range of works share a set of core animating questions centered on themes of equality, democracy, freedom, and culture. Above all, in my view, this interview allows us to appreciate the extent to which Patterson is a West Indian intellectual, part of an intellectual tradition that includes key figures such as C.L.R. James and Eric Williams. For readers of Slavery and Social Death or Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, it might appear that Patterson is above all a global social theorist. Readers of works such as The Ordeal of Integration might understand him to be primarily a sociologist of Black America. And of course, both of these are true. But really, without appreciating how Patterson's work emerges from a specifically West Indian set of preoccupations and orientations, we're liable to misread these works, and also to miss what remain core concerns for Patterson. As Patterson tells Scott near the end of the interview when discussing his 2019 book, The Confounding Island, quote, "I have never left Jamaica intellectually." Rather than an awaited return then, Patterson views his recent effort to take stock of Jamaica's political and cultural development as part of a long-running conversation that began with his first book, The Sociology of Slavery. The questions posed in that early work about the disintegration of societies and cultures in the wake of transatlantic slavery, the resources available for resistance and the reconstruction of social life in the wake of that disintegration, and the values and orientations generated from the experience of slavery reappear as key touchstones of Patterson's work throughout his long career. I will, in the course of my remarks today, say more about what it means to read Patterson as a West Indian intellectual, but I want to say at the outset that to relocate him in these terms is or should not be understood as a parochialization of him and his work. Instead, I think what this interview makes clear and what his career makes clear more generally is a way it makes visible why and how the Caribbean has been a place to think particularity and universality together. And I'll say more about this at the end. So I want to focus on my time today on three things. First, contextualizing this book in the wider project of chronicling a West Indian intellectual tradition, which David Scott and the journal Small Axe has been conducting since 1997, really. Second, I want to describe the upshots of locating Patterson within this intellectual tradition in terms of how we understand his work. And finally, I want to think about how his specific interventions and criticisms of his field of sociology and the social sciences more broadly stem from this particular location. So first, the interview. So as I've noted, this initial interview was published in Small Axe, the Journal of Caribbean Criticism, founded by David Scott. It's, for those who don't know, it's one of a series of interviews that David Scott has conducted over the years with key Jamaican and West Indian intellectuals. And the figures represented in this series include the Garvey scholar Robert Hill, the cultural theorist and philosopher Sylvia Wynter, the political economist Lloyd Best, among many, many others. While what we have before us then is the intellectual biography of Patterson in the form of this interview, when we resituated it within this wider context of this series of biographical dialogues, we can appreciate the generational intellectual and political context from which Patterson emerged. Scott has understood his project really as a generational one. He describes a generation as a group of people having been subjected to similar formative experiences, such as political upheavals or natural disasters. So the question for him isn't about being cotemporal, right? We're all experienced the last election together, but about having had a set of formative experiences at the same time around the same moment. And in particular, he's been interested in chronicling the generation of West Indian scholars who were born at the close of the colonial period and for whom the drama of decolonization was their formative experience. And Scott understands this really as an intergenerational project, as a West Indian scholar himself, but born in coming to age, political and intellectual age in the 1970s and 80s. It's an effort to understand the generation before him and to trace out through these interviews an intellectual inheritance. So in the diversity of the interviews and the range of political and ideological, intellectual positions represented through them, we return again and again to two features that have been central to the formation of this generation of West Indian intellectuals. The first is the experience of decolonization, and the second is the institution of the University of the West Indies. So let me say something about both. Throughout the early parts of the interview, as we see Patterson finish at Kingston College, enter University College of the West Indies, the kind of arrival of independence is in the air. And what I think we get from this set of interviews is really a sense of the multiplicity of meanings of decolonization. So yes, it did mean political sovereignty, the end of colonial rule, but it also meant the formation of a national culture, right? The emergence of a set of writers, novelists, social scientists who are beginning to shape the political and political culture of the new country. And this context already generates a set of questions for these intellectuals. What can and should independence mean? How does that transition from colony to post-colony appear? And this particular set of questions, time and time again, generates a historical turn for the figures involved. So immediately trying to understand this moment of transition, this moment of independence, generates a question about the pasts of Jamaica or the pasts of the region, and in particular leads to a variety of people writing about the history of slavery. So Patterson's book, The Sociology of Slavery, emerges in a context of a number of West Indian scholars trying to wrestle with the history and legacies of slavery for the region. I think we also get from this set of interviews a clear sense that the skepticism about the limits of political decolonization are already being worked out in the very moment in which that project is in formation. So like many of his generation, Patterson is a critic of the middle-class nationalism that comes to shape the trajectories of independence. He makes this very clear in the interview when he writes that the unifying nationalist promise, out of many one, struck him as a fiction, one that papered over kind of the deep inequalities and hierarchies of Jamaican society. But I think one thing that makes Patterson idiosyncratic is that the forms of critique that he articulates then and continues to articulate in a book like The Confounding Island don't fit neat ideological positions. So I think for many, there's two general positions of critiquing that middle-class project, a kind of Marxist critique of that project, which is voiced by a number of figures, and a kind of Black power, Black nationalist critique of middle-class nationalism. And it seems to me that Patterson's position vis-a-vis the nationalist project never fits neatly into either one of these ideologies, which is a kind of reoccurring story of his various political and intellectual positions. So that's decolonization. Another thing I think that really, it's so hard to appreciate this, I think, sitting at an institution like Harvard or the University of Chicago, is the centrality of the post-colonial university. First, that the birth of the university arrives at the moment of the birth of the nation also. So University College of the West Indies is chartered, as many institutions of higher education in the British Empire were connected to institutions in England, primarily University College of London. It becomes in this particular case, not a national institution, but really a federal institution. It's the University of the West Indies. And it becomes a formative space for this young generation who's experiencing the birth of post-colonial freedom to experience themselves in a new light. So Patterson notes in the interview that the University of the West Indies was a cosmopolitan space. It's a space that one arrived at as Trinidadian or Jamaican, but came in the process of that context to understand oneself as West Indian. He describes, which is great for me because I've written about this, campaigning for the formation of the Federation of the West Indies. So we see, I think, in this way, really the kind of close connection between the experience of political decolonization and the decolonization of knowledge. And I think that's a very popular formulation in the contemporary moment, but it's a really different way of posing that problem of the decolonization of knowledge, in the sense that what people are after in the context of the University of the West Indies is how to create, in Orlando Patterson's case, a social science that comes to terms with the particular kinds of challenges, questions posed by the post-colony. So how to create a usable social science, a set of concepts, a set of theories that can grasp the particular political predicaments of the post-colony. So that's, I've probably spent a long time on that, but so I now want to turn to just what's at stake in reading Orlando Patterson as a kind of West Indian intellectual. And here, I'll just say, I think I have three points I'd like to make here. The very first one, I think, and I've already alluded to this, is how history and historicization becomes so central. So in that moment of transition, in the moment of experiencing a radical rupture of the colonial moment, this search for historicization and thinking about the present in terms of the past becomes really important to Patterson, but to really everyone writing in that context from various ideological positions. So again, Rodney was mentioned in Chris's introduction, who's a classmate of Patterson's. They go about that process of historicization differently. The problem to which they're the present problem to which they're engaged in that process of historical reconstruction are different, but yet over and over again, there's a turn to historicization as a kind of way of coming to grips with the present. In the interview, Patterson rejects the label of historicism, but he notes that social problems have historical sources that must be understood in order to grasp their configuration in the present. I think the second really interesting feature of this kind of tradition is the experimentation with genre and form. So many readers of The Paradox of Freedom will be surprised that Patterson wrote not just one, but 3 novels. And again, this kind of facility and fluidity of genre and form is something that characterizes a wide array of West Indian intellectuals. So C.L.R. James, who Patterson is writing about currently, wrote a novel called Minty Alley and a play before he wrote his canonical classic text, Black Jacobins. Sylvia Wynter inaugurates her thinking on humanism with her novel, The Hills of Hebron. So there's this real openness to the ways in which different genres and forms make possible alternative ways of rendering the political problems that the author is concerned with, or with making visible certain kinds of social dynamics that may be difficult to capture, say, in the register of social science. And the interview really helps us, I think, appreciate the interplay between Patterson's novels and his sociological work. So the consequences of the social disintegration theorized first in the sociology of slavery is reflected in the marginalization and inequality that's explored in his first novel, The Children of Sisyphus. The novel, Die the Long Day, works out the question of where resistance emerges from that's briefly addressed at the end of the sociology of slavery. But then it also anticipates the central role Patterson allocated to enslaved women in inaugurating the value of freedom in his book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture. So I think really, more needs to be written and said about this dynamic interplay between novels, drama, poetry, and social scientific and historical writing that characterizes the Caribbean in this period. And in particular, it's worth noting what allows for this experimentation in genre, what formative educational context made that possible. And I think really we might think about the role of an imperial education with its emphasis on humanistic inquiry and engagement with the classics, how that shaped this kind of tradition of scholars. So I think attention to this educational backdrop also might help to illuminate how Patterson and others within this intellectual tradition demonstrate a very specific relationship to the West or to Western civilization. Readers will note that in a book like Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, Patterson does not pose the problem of a paradoxical connection between freedom and slavery as an outsider, but instead as an inheritor of the values and traditions of Western culture. This self-conception as an immanent critic rather than an external observer of Western civilization is, I think, a really unique feature of the West Indian intellectual tradition. I work as much on African political thought as I do on the Caribbean, and I think in other post-colonial contexts, for a variety of reasons, there's a kind of externality that you don't see within the West Indian intellectual tradition. This has something to do with, in part, with intellectual formation. Patterson notes finding a copy of a book on the Italian Renaissance from his secondary school that he's marked up religiously. And this reminds me of something James says in Beyond a Boundary, which is that he read Thackeray's Vanity Fair over and over and over again, which is very difficult to imagine, but alas. And I think, again, this is just, it shows you the ways in which this kind of, a kind of formation within the terms of an imperial education shapes the particular positionality. It also means, I think, that there's an approach to the question of Western culture or Western civilization that takes the form of problematization rather than transcending or overcoming the West. And I think this is perhaps most clear in the elaboration of the paradox of freedom of slavery and freedom in the making of Western culture. But you also see it in the most recent, The Confounding Island, where something like the violence of Jamaican society is viewed as an internal dynamic of its democratic and participatory ethos rather than its outside. So I think in each of these contexts, what Patterson makes visible is a deep sense of the contingency and internal fragility of the values that we, the West, hold dear, and a sense of their reversibility, right? The fact that they're not set in stone. So my final point, which I'll be very quick about, is that by understanding Patterson's emergence from within this West Indian intellectual tradition, we can better appreciate the sources of his interventions in sociology and the social sciences in particular. He lodges two specific challenges, I think, to all of us who are social scientists, ahistoricism and parochialism. So I've already discussed the importance of historicization, but let me say something about parochialism. Scott notes in his introduction that, quote, in Patterson's hermeneutic itinerary, Jamaica is simultaneously the concrete ground of historical particularity and an instance of moral universality. This insistence on both specificity and universality can again, I think, be understood as a recurring theme of the West Indian political and social theory. And I would say it's what makes the best of post-colonial theory, good. And I think there's a way in which the West Indies becomes this important space for theorizing particularity and universality together, because it's a space where the kind of predicaments of modernity are intensified, right? It's a society that's peopled entirely through, forced migration, forced and unforced migration. It's a region at the founding heart of global capitalism. It's a space by the 20th century where the experience of democratization that happened in the West over 2 centuries happens in the span of decades, maybe years. So it's really about this intensification of the experience of modernity that generates both a sense of specificity to the region and also makes it a perfect instance in which that specificity can actually illuminate something about the universal modern experience. Patterson's answer to that particular question of how to square the particular and the universal occurs through two features of his work, which he talks about in the interview. The first is induction, and the second is comparison. So I think you see this most clearly in Slavery and Social Death, but it's a feature of all of his work, which tries to take concrete instances of a phenomenon and search out family resemblances. And in Slavery and Social Death, he uses a really, I think, wonderful metaphor to describe what in the interview he calls grounded theory, and he turns to this agricultural metaphor. So as he puts it, the generation of a concept like social death emerges from the work of, quote, a heavy plow that must first clear the ground, turn the soil, and demarcate the boundaries. So there's this solitary exercise of not foregoing theoretical generalization and generalizability without absconding from the realm of empirical conditions. And I think that's the kind of marriage of the particular and universal for Patterson. So I'll just stop there and thank you very much.
Can folks hear me? Is it okay if I stay here? So first, I'd just like to say thank you very much to Chris for bringing us together, to Matt, to all the organizers for putting this together, and to Professor Patterson for writing this tremendous book. Thank you as well to David Scott for just doing a terrific job of interviewing and teasing out like wonderful bits of information and threads of conversation. I strongly recommend those that haven't had the opportunity to read this volume. Chris is definitely not overselling it by emphasizing how gripping it is and what a page turner the material is. I should say I feel especially honored to be here because this is the first time I've had the opportunity to meet Professor Patterson. And in a way, it's especially meaningful for me because I think of myself as having read Orlando on the page now for over 20 years. And so having been in a kind of one-sided conversation, and so in a sense, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, I thought, it would be sort of productive for me in thinking about the ways in which this is an intellectual biography to speak a bit about what I feel like I've gleaned from reading the text over these years and what sort of came home in reading this material again. And I should say that the very first time that I read anything by Orlando was when I was in graduate school and basically pretty lost and groping around for clarity about my dissertation topic. So for those of you that are in this position now, we've all been through it in some way, it'll be okay. And what I wanted to do was that I wanted to write, I was in a PhD program in political theory, and I think it's actually interesting, maybe something worth reflecting on, that all three of us are political theorists. So I was a PhD program in political theory, and I wanted to write on the idea of equal and effective freedom. So notions of freedom, I didn't have clarity about what freedom meant, and have it located too in the particular struggles of the US, so a theoretical examination of freedom. And part of what I was really struggling with was something that, in a sense, was just a product of my own personal background, which is, so I'm American, but my family is also Kenyan, and I think of myself as really from both places, and in a deep sense, a person of the third world. That's what sort of shapes my general outlook and understanding of both the US and global politics more generally. And thinking about freedom, I couldn't help just intuitively to feel these two things at once about the country that I found myself located in. On the one hand, the country seemed to be the embodiment, structurally, of the very negation of all the basic principles that I wanted to articulate. So the big structural realities of slavery, settler colonialism, empire, modes of capitalist class domination, what we would today call racial capitalism, that seemed to shape the limitations of what was possible and that produced a kind of brittleness in response to my experience of my own surroundings. Yet at the same time, it was no doubt also the case that the folks that I looked up to as heroes, however flawed, or the kinds of arguments that I saw as offering some kind of pathway out of the thicket, also felt like they were located in this place in different ways. And making sense of those two things at once felt incredibly difficult to do without falling prey to a variety of different kinds of limiting and, to my sense, already sort of self-defeating variations, like self-congratulation on the one hand, or a kind of radical rejectionism on the other. And reading Patterson, so in particular reading the volume 1 on freedom, as well as eventually like the material on slavery more generally, felt like it gave me guides to address a series of different problems. So one was a problem with method. Like if I was committed to intellectual production in the academy, how could I translate all of these different sentiments and concerns into something that was actually cognizable as scholarship? Especially at a moment in time, honestly, this is not that long ago. I like to think I'm not too old, but 20 years ago, where truly the things that I cared most about were not topics that you wrote about in political theory. So you didn't write about empire, you didn't write about settler colonialism, you really didn't write about slavery or capitalism. So how could I translate it through a clear method? Second, how could I actually then synthesize for myself in a way that was convincing precisely that double feeling I had of my own experience in the country in a way that didn't feel like it fell prey to these various destructive potential tendencies? And then third, how could I maintain as a political and intellectual ethic, but especially as a political ethic, because that's why I was doing a project in political theory, a kind of humaneness toward the experience of those, even those that I basically disagree with, like an ethic of humanity in treating the complexity of the social experience. So I'd like to just work through what reading Patterson assisted me with in each of those dimensions, and then end with not exactly a challenge, but a question that I still sort of struggle with and that I wonder what your response might be to. So first on method. In political theory, the way that you studied a topic like freedom was through a focus on ideas, and ideas oftentimes either drawn from canonical thinkers or abstracted through a set of analytical tools. And so that's basically how I started, and I started by reading the canonical figures that were presented to me, but in a way precisely because of my own discontent with this built-in tension, I found that really unsatisfying. So reading, for instance, it could be Locke. Tocqueville was a central figure for me, so I was spending a lot of time reading Tocqueville. At the same time, I had this thought, which was, wait a second, what were they actually practically committed to? What, in fact, was their politics? Because any time you moved from that domain of absolute abstraction to an assessment of how their ideas in fact hit the ground, that's when one got confronted by the fact that somebody like Locke, for instance, was involved in the construction of the Constitution for the Carolinas, or backing the use of workhouses for children as young as 3, or Tocqueville was deeply involved in the project of empire. So all of the things that I found troubling about the history felt real every time I moved away from the unit of abstraction. At the same time, it didn't seem like just going to historical specificity was a sufficient solution, because the kind of history that was especially then quite common in history departments emphasized its own complexity, whereby you couldn't actually make trans-historical arguments that allowed you to see structure across time and then recognize where freedom emerged. You were just sort of left with data, empirical data in all its complexity, and a suspicion of making any kind of broad claims. And here, the thing that, and this is detailed extensively, because one of the themes in the book is the question of method and historical sociology, but one of the things that Patterson seemed to do in the writing was link the ideas to history in a way that allowed you to both appreciate structure, but then understand the political import of the claims being made. So in other words, that it was a framework that emphasized the extent to which ideas translate, in his language, into value through the institutionalization of those ideas. They're spread as a grounding for the society, and that's a product of material conditions that exist, and that you can only get a sense of whether or not a particular account, for instance, of freedom is something that's liberating or instead subordinating by recognizing how it's playing off against the backdrop of certain types of structural dynamics. And by seeing the relationship between the two, then you can recognize also in those particular contexts who's making arguments, oftentimes arguments that are emerging from the bottom up from those that are oppressed, that in fact is transformative, and what types of claims, even under the guise of liberating language, are elite mechanisms for instantiating various forms of domination, and that this is a continuous push and pull that exists through a relationship between the ideas and the structural experience. That was totally eye-opening as an alternative way to avoid what I viewed as both the limitations of political theory and of history. And then there's this question about, well, then what to make of the complexity? So if you have a method, and the method is to attempt to understand how ideas become institutionalized as values in the context of concrete political struggles shaped by background structural conditions where you're kind of ecumenical about material reality. You don't have to be some truly doctrinaire Marxist in terms of thinking about what counts as structure versus superstructure. Then, like, how to make sense of the complexity of both, on the one hand, profound forms of oppression, and on the other hand, liberating narratives of possibility. And what Patterson's argument did was it felt like it was a through line between two distinct tendencies. And you see this especially in the US, but I think it's a broader story besides the US that you can see in lots of different Western contexts. So the first was self-congratulation, namely that in the context of slavery, slavery is something that should be thought of as aberrational. Because it's aberrational, the primary trajectory of American life can be understood as a particular kind of commitment to liberal freedom, and that the overcoming of slavery is therefore then proof of the fact that the country's basic essence is this overcoming. Or a more sophisticated version, there's an uneasy mix between the two. There's slavery, there's freedom, they're separate. Because they're separate, there's a fight between the two, and over time, it might not be necessary. Over time, one will win out, and the purpose of like a liberal consensus or a liberal project is to have freedom win out over slavery. At the same time, there's a competing argument that basically says, well, the persistence of various forms of servitude speak to the fact that there's nothing ever liberating about the underlying ideas or commitments, that it's always been a kind of ruse, that what we see is preservation through transformation and a kind of flattening of political experience that in this way doesn't account for realities of change, the ways in which there are aspirational possibilities, there are transformative projects that succeed even partially, there are intense forms of movement that generate alternatives that even if they're just held on to for the future seem like they're worth grappling with. And the argument that Patterson provided was that we can think of freedom and slavery as politically, and I'm curious whether or not you'd agree with this, but this is what I took from it, as politically embedded, so as constitutively joined, maybe not at the level of philosophy, which is why thinking just abstractly about the idea felt like it wasn't as productive, but in any embodied reality that's marked by actual material experience for people, freedom and subordination, freedom and slavery are necessarily constitutively bound. And the experience of that binding is the process by which communities, especially those that are oppressed, come to understand the possibility of emancipation, and that then engage in various projects of change and transformation. Yet, you can never really get outside of that bind, because necessarily any new iteration produces its own constitutively joined forms of freedom and subordination. And so on the one hand, you can express and give like real truth to the persistence of various forms of violence that individuals experience, while at the same time recognizing that there's an inherent combination between that and the very things that one might want to embrace as like worthy of both defending and as productive of the kinds of transformations that in fact have existed in American life and more broadly. It's the reason why my first book was called The Two Faces of American Freedom. Now that then connects to a question about like an ethic of politics. Like how does one respond if you've both have the method and you've now developed like this assessment of how freedom and subordination, I'm using that as a broader category, are linked together. And it strikes me that perhaps like the most important thing that is consistent across all of the writing is a deep and profound respect for the actual lived experiences that people have faced, especially those that are oppressed, and the kinds of goals and commitments that they've had. And the way that this to me comes across is by continuously rejecting a type of either-orism that oftentimes marks the way that like we think about politics. And I think that this rejection of an either-orism even sort of like affects some of the arguments that Orlando's made that can be thought of as more controversial. So, for instance, this is part of what I see is there in the arguments about integration. So the thought here is that societies like the US are necessarily plural, and they join together these various forms of freedom and subordination. And the thing that sometimes has been presented as integration is really a kind of violent assimilation in which communities that are oppressed are compelled essentially to accept as a condition of entrance the permanence of their own domination through structures that essentially break their own independent identity. At the same time, though, the response cannot be just a rejection of the fact that people are necessarily thrown together in societies that are complex, even folks that they disagree pretty profoundly. There has to be a way of holding on to self-determination, even self-determination grounded in race, but that nonetheless recognizes the importance of operating and existing in a coalitional way, but also within institutions that are genuinely integrated. And that, as he writes in the book, and as he's written elsewhere, that the conditions that sustain Jim Crow and that today, I believe, are part of like a revanchist return to fairly straightforward forms of white nationalism are oftentimes grounded in an effort to resegregate collective life, to separate people so that they don't recognize their shared solidarities. And this then requires a politics that's committed to integration, but that also recognizes that integration has to be organized in ways that ensure that everybody has the opportunity to participate fully in society and to construct the forms of solidarity that can actually generate meaningful change. And it's a kind of humanism that then, and this is why I think there's the rejection both of self-congratulation and political defeatism, that sees many of these either-ors as ultimately like deeply suspicious of the capacity of ordinary people to assert agency, to control the conditions of their own lives, to pursue various political projects that are outside of the domination of big structures or of imposing elites. And that there's a suspicion, I think, in the writing that when you hear that, you know, it's the conditions, for instance, of oppression mean that it's very hard to imagine agency for oppressed people, that's a kind of defeatism that is essentially deeply anti-democratic as a little d ethos, or an argument that's wary of the possibility of interracial coalition building, or sees this moment as saying that folks that might be part of a white working class can never actually support or back political change in ways that might be racially inclusive, is again a way of rejecting both the complexity of the historical past and also the possibilities that are embedded within communities on the ground. And so this is where I'll end. It leads me to a puzzle that I've always found in the work and that honestly I'm still struggling with, which is the very commitment to a type of ethics of humanity that appreciates complexity, that rejects either or thinking, that avoids a kind of binary. It then produces two different types of tendencies I see in the prescriptive dimension of Orlando's work. One tendency is a strong desire for oppressed communities to reclaim their own agency by asserting a kind of moral self-criticism, but also like moral project. In other words, that one of the things that's worth embracing about the civil rights movement, worth embracing even about figures like Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey, is the inward focus, but the focus on the capacity of the community to address its own problems, whether this has to do with gender relations, whether it has to do with internal limits on the tools to actually engage in various forms of social change. And so a recognition of agency, a commitment to humanity, produces a kind of politics that can be quite ruptural, which is the existing forms of organization within the community have to be radically shifted based on moral projects that take seriously self-critique and that alter the terms of whether it's family or social organization or political commitment. Yet at the same time, there's also this thought, which is, yes, there are these massive structures that constrain agency, but one should be wary of a kind of ruptural romantic politics that thinks that you can just break free of these structures. And so this is how I read some elements of Orlando's critique of the left, whether in Jamaica or in the US, which is, we are thrown into these structures. These structures have knitted together good things and bad things. These structures can be shifted and moved, but if we go too far down the path of thinking that they should be wholesale revised, we in a sense can fall into those traps, those either-or traps, where we engage in a kind of rejectionism that's deeply destructive and that in a way has a type of meanness toward the lived experience that people have and the very real, if partial, benefits that folks get from our existing systems. There's a moment for somebody that's critical of the US Constitution. There's an interesting moment in the text where Orlando defends the Constitution, or at least the rule of law, as an alternative mechanism, however flawed, for producing social cohesion and for providing people various kinds of rights and benefits. And I don't necessarily disagree with either the kind of radical rupturism that seems to operate in the domain of thinking about the internal community, or the desire for a type of responsibility, an ethic of responsibility when thinking about chucking institutions writ large. But I just note that that's a tension. And I also note that sometimes there can be a meanness toward various kinds of requirements placed on the internal community. And sometimes there can be a profound humanity to arguing for radical, aspirational changes to the structures that define our world, even if those radical aspirational changes cannot be fully met or can only be truly very minimally met within the terms of our existing political lives. And so I wonder how to make sense of that tension and to what extent there's place still for the reversal of it. Circumstances where we might want to call for dramatic changes to the institutions that we exist in, and circumstances where we might want to give grace to those communities that we seek to be part of. Thank you.
So thank you to Chris and Deirdre and Matt for organizing this event and for inviting me. I'm a bit starstruck, I'll admit. I've always been a fan of Orlando's writing, but I have to say this particular book was awe-inspiring. You know, it's a life that brings together, C.L.R. James and Talcott Parsons, Walter Rodney and Perry Anderson, Michael Manley and somehow Gerald Ford. He's a novelist, and then he's like a path-breaking historical sociologist, and then somehow he has time to also develop aspects of Jamaican housing and educational policy. By the end of it, I was like, I want to be like Orlando when I grow up. Unfortunately, it's too late for me. But it's a stunning read, and I wanted to say sort of one further note of appreciation and then just use this as a chance to ask Orlando 3 questions. Maybe one about his big questions, since he is really someone committed to the big questions. So one about slavery, one about freedom, and one about self-emancipation, very similar to what Aziz ended on here. So the note of appreciation is this. One thing that I've always found compelling about Orlando's work, but which really leaps off the pages of the interviews, is his sort of ruthless commitment to facing reality as it is, and how it is that people act in the situations that they find themselves. And that this isn't just about sort of recognizing contradiction, but being able to make sense of and being honest about all the really morally unsettling and paradoxical features of human history. So this shows up, for instance, in how Orlando talks about Cujo and the maroon betrayal of the slaves and the slave revolts in Jamaica, or how he talks about the effects of slavery on family and gender relations, or his routine contempt for people who want to turn history into a usable past. And there's something really humanistic about the way Orlando writes in this vein. It's very hard to capture through a particular quotation, but it's deeply humanistic, sort of a nothing human is alien to me way of approaching the material. And it's all the more incredible that he carries this off in everything he writes, and it's all the more incredible given that he's writing about, or often the central object is one of the most absolute, enduring, and horrific evil, which is slavery. And it somehow comes through with a special for this aspect of him, which is sort of like, it's not a method, it's a disposition that informs everything he does, that I really admire, and it comes out somehow with special force in the interview format. So another advertisement for the book, and for anyone doing anything. It's not just if you're doing social science. I think it's like a way to approach life. So the questions. So my first question is about slavery. So, and in particular, what Orlando thinks about terms like wage slavery or domestic slavery, or even more recently, the invocation of terms like abolition. Because as most of you know, seems like probably everybody here knows, one of Orlando's signature contributions to our understanding of the world is to understand slavery as social death. And social death is a very specific social condition. It's a condition in which the slave continues their natural existence, but they have no legitimate claim on society. So they can make no claims in relation to those who can make claims. So yes, they might have families, but they cannot claim those kin as their own. And so there's nothing essentially racial, although it can be racial, nothing essentially about ownership, although it can be organized around the concept of ownership. It's essentially this condition of social death. Now, if Orlando's right about slavery, and I think he is, then this sort of raises a question about, well, it at least imposes a very strict discipline on what we may validly call slavery, and then how far we can extend that term. And that raises questions for how people who have struggled against and thought about other forms of domination are supposed to talk about it, and we validly talk about it. Because we know that there are various social movements that overlapped with abolition or extended afterwards that were facing very severe and significant forms of domination that were not conditions of social death, like the labor movement struggling against what they called wage slavery, or women struggling against the patriarchal household, which they called domestic slavery. And to be clear, I'm not talking about situations where you have sort of hysterical conceptual inflation of the term to apply to even the most minor injustices. I'm not asking that question. I think it's kind of obvious what's going wrong in those cases. But in cases where we can say people are struggling against systematic and enduring forms of domination, but which don't involve social death, their personality is not denied, what are we to say about the way in which people have historically used the term to describe it? I think perhaps Orlando is going to say, well, we have to impose some conceptual discipline. We call slavery, slavery, and we have other terms. Domination, subjection, oppression, alienation, exploitation, to name and describe and understand these other conditions. Is that what Orlando wants us to think? Or is it not just about being scientifically accurate? Is there something really morally wrong about overextending the concept to name these other conditions of domination? And if so, what's wrong about it? Or is there something to be said for it? And how does that sort of, what does that have to say of not just about sort of historic cases, but even contemporary use of terms like abolition to talk about, I don't know, the condition of mass incarceration or police brutality or things like that? Is that an appropriate use, a misuse, an unacceptable abuse or abuse of terms? So that's a first question that sort of I was reminded of as I was reading the book. A second question is really, it's really the other side of the first, which is that we might think that the ongoing use of the term abolition is just proof that Orlando is right, and that he's right about what he says in Freedom in the Making of the Modern World, which is that freedom, the way we understand freedom, is inseparable from slavery. It was born, it's an ancient term. All the essential meaning was born in ancient Greece and Rome in the struggle to negate freedom. Freedom's just to be, negate slavery. So freedom just is to be understood as a condition that is opposed to the negative of slavery. But I wonder if there's something insufficient or misplaced about talking about freedom in a modern society as the opposite of slavery, or understanding it only in those terms. After all, I think a signature feature of many modern struggles for freedom is that the formal freedom of not being a slave is incomplete, and that one can be a wholly independent, recognized member of a society, a member of the beloved community, as it were, that has abolished slavery, and yet still be unfree. And that there's even a sense in which, in modern life, being constituted as a free person is also a way of constituting the distinctive forms of unfreedom that people suffer. So a famous example is Marx. Marx says that the way to understand the unfreedom of the wage laborer is precisely that they are masterless individuals. They're free to make contracts with whomever they like, but it's through that freedom that then they are forced to make the labor contracts that make them exploited and dominated. That's one example. There are many others, though. For instance, it seems to be part of the post-colonial condition, the struggle to say that mere political independence and formal independence isn't, in fact, freedom. And if we're merely formally independent, that is how we become subject to these sort of neo-colonial forms of domination. And if any of this is right, then it seems like there's something about modern life that has added to our understanding of freedom, that it isn't just built out of the experience of overcoming slavery, but that there is some distinctively modern failure of reciprocity that isn't the same as the total negation of human personality, and that deserves the name a problem of unfreedom, that gives us some sense of a freedom we might want to claim, but which is distinctively modern and explains perhaps why the language of abolition is then inappropriate. It's a mistake, because we need a different kind of language for thinking about the kinds of freedom we still want or are struggling for. So finally, I want to circle back. This is my third question for Orlando, which is on the topic of self-emancipation. And this is in the vein of Aziz's comments. I promise we didn't coordinate on this. Because one of the most vivid parts of the interview for me, and something that really sort of made me kind of put down the book as I read it and have to think, was Orlando talking about the wounds of oppression, and sometimes even the self-inflicted wounds of oppression. And so over and over, Orlando talks about how, say, slavery and other forms of extreme subordination are not just sort of morally wrong, but they are intensely and severely psychologically and socially damaging. And that we can't understand anything about these institutions, can't speak properly about them if we don't understand them as ways of damaging human beings. So the Holocaust of slavery, or the ethnocidal aspect of slavery, is not just the murder of millions, but the way in which it's the total destruction of the social life of the living. And that this has lasting psychological and cultural effects on their sense of trust and freedom, on family and gender relations. And if this is the case, then I want to know what that leads us to think about the prospect and possibility of self-emancipation. Because it seems to me it's equally important to Orlando that we appreciate that the oppressed are moral agents. He talks a lot about moral responsibility, autonomy, self-determination. And how are we to think about self-emancipation once we have properly acknowledged the wounds of oppression, as Orlando calls it sometime? Because normally in the academy, to the degree that self-emancipation is discussed at all, it's discussed as this sort of bland collective action problem. So how will they get together and figure out how to coordinate their activity to exercise their power over society to overcome the structures that oppress them? But I take it for Orlando that an equally fundamental problem is the problem of self-transformation, of how to exercise collective power over the culture that has been inherited. And that is why he places such emphasis on things like inward-directed social movements, to describe the kinds of emancipatory movements he's talking about. And I ask this question because Orlando is one of the few people, I've been lately reading a lot about the question of self-emancipation in a similar state of concern that Aziz described, only it was back when he was a graduate student. I was like, what is the term self-emancipation about? And Orlando is one of the few, I think, that I've encountered so far who speaks so directly and forthrightly about the problem of the damage that oppression does to those who are oppressed. That it isn't just a question of how are they going to exercise power, but how are they going to transform themselves through their own activity, and who is so critical of everyone else who fails to make this problem central to their way of thinking. This is one of those areas where Orlando's humanistic realism, as I think, really comes out and where I admire it. And I also ask this question to Orlando because it seems to me that there is a way in which there's now a widespread set of sociological and political arguments that really want to dial up the wounds of oppression thing. For instance, the idea of intergenerational trauma, and which is this, there's versions of it, but that there are these sort of inherited psychocultural structures in which groups are trapped in virtue of their oppression. The implication, never really spelled out, is that we therefore can't treat the oppressed as moral agents because they're trapped by this intergenerational damage that oppression has done. And if we were to, in fact, expect them in any way to emancipate themselves, that's just blaming the victim. It's holding them responsible for a condition that they themselves can't escape from. Now, I know that isn't what Orlando thinks, but it's another way of putting the question: how does one balance, in one sense, the sense that there are these lasting structures, inherited structures of damage from oppression, and yet continue to hold out and think through what it means for the oppressed to emancipate themselves through their own activity, which I know is remains a deep concern for Orlando. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, very, very much. This is extremely challenging. And, I could spend all night going over each of the many sort of very pertinent, very relevant, deeply probing issues which have been identified in my work. And much of what I agree with. I mean, the questions you've raised are questions I indeed have grappled with all my life and still do, and don't necessarily have answers to. Very often, posing a question the right way is as important as coming up with the right answers. And I see myself as posing questions, hard questions, as much as attempting to answer them. But just to briefly go through some of the very interesting questions which are raised here. The first speaker, Adom, sort of very rightly, and I'm very happy she does, raise the question of the West Indian Caribbean context of my work. Interestingly, I'm very much involved with doing the same thing with another Caribbean writer. I'm now trying to write a biography of C.L.R. James, who belonged to the generation before me, but who in fact, and the more I read it, the more I sort of have these moments in which I said, my God, I mean, I went through that, but you know, he is 40 years older than I am, but yes, there's no way the issues I raise and the way in which I approach these problems can be understood outside of the context of this very peculiar part of the world I grew up in, and sort of my intellectual development, in a sense, began in and was very formed by. The Caribbean is an unusual part of the world. These are these mainly island states, small, and but you know, it's where much of the modern world began. When I tell this to my students in my Caribbean course, they always scratch their head and wonder what I'm talking about. But they get the point eventually. I mean, this is where European imperialism began. This is where slavery, large-scale modern slavery, in a sense, began. This is where capitalism remarkably began. As the new modern historians of capitalism have reluctantly come to discover, not as much as I'd like them to, but no, it didn't begin in America. But also, it also is a part of the world where you had the first real total detribalization of people, deracination and reconstruction, the need to reconstruct a world. This is very unusual. And of course, in the course of reconstructing that world, you both have to emancipate yourself, rediscover yourself, but also work with what you have. And what you have was Western civilization, sort of hovering over you, you know, in all its might and force. And, you know, this comes out clearly in the person I'm writing about now, C.L.R. James, who makes no secret of the fact that he is Western. In fact, he describes himself as an Afro-Saxon, and he doesn't apologize for it. So this is where it begins. And his complete engagement with that most British of cultural productions, cricket, which was central to his thinking, and the most British of games. So the question is the paradox, the torment of Caribbean society going. And this, by the way, is true of the French Caribbean too. Is how does one make sense of this horrendous past using the intellectual and cultural tools of the oppressor's culture in which you are totally immersed? And the problem is there's nowhere to escape to except this. If you want to read, if you want to learn to read, you had to learn to read through the British textbooks, readers which came from England, and you know, loaded with British symbolism, And the task of being able to use an oppressor's tools not only to criticize the oppressive condition, but also in positive ways, is a struggle which all Caribbean people went through, which I think accounts for both the success as well as the failures of Caribbean intellectual life. I mean, and the successes are quite striking. You know, I mean, I like to tease my students by asking them, what country do you think has the highest per capita number of Nobel laureates? It's, Sweden, Germany, Israel. No, it's the little island of St. Lucia, which with a population of 90,000 has produced 2 Nobel laureates. You're never going to get a per capita production like that. But it's something which, bothers me. It's bothered me from when I was at high school, and Chris mentioned my sort of involvement with Burckhardt's Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. I was reading that at age 16 and struggling over it and trying to make sense of it. And in the end, of course, I think what I did, what I think James did, was instead of mourning over the damage done, although one recognizes it, and I'll get to that shortly, one sees how one can use these tools both to understand not only the oppression but oneself and how to move forward. And this is easily misunderstood. So recognizing the experience of slavery, first in my own society, but then asking, well, what was it like for other slaves, for other slave conditions, and what is the implication of this horrendous condition? And one then moves to recognize that, the Europeans were the slave holders, but what was slavery like among Europeans themselves? And then moving to recognize that, in fact, the first slave societies was, in fact, in ancient Greece, and is, in fact, the foundation of Western civilization. I mean, that, when I first recognized that, which is basically towards the end of my high school years, I mean, that kind of blew my mind, that, because my initial thinking as a child growing up, reading about the history, is that this is something peculiar to the West Indies and black people in the Caribbean, only to discover that the origins of European civilization were in fact in a large-scale, a pretty brutal large-scale slave society. And one constantly sort of try to make sense of, in making sense of this, I mean, there is sort of so much to discover, and you eventually give up the initial tendency to reject all things Western, to recognize that whether you like it or not, you are very much part of this Western experience, and that they themselves, in a sense, had gone through a similar process. So that's how, in fact, from very early, I came to recognize the need to, one of the best ways of coming to terms with some of the problems I was facing is to look at it historically and comparatively. And once you do that, it, on the one hand, is not only theoretically very valuable, but it's also personally very, soothing, shall we say. yes, you're right about the University of the West Indies experience. One of the best things, one of the luckiest things that happened to me, and I mentioned it in one of the part of the interviews, is the fact that when I graduated in the Caribbean, in all the islands, and James writes about this a lot, during the colonial period, there were two scholarships given to go study in the mother country, usually Oxford or Cambridge, and the Jamaica Scholarship and the Centenary Scholarship. And having come, graduated at the top of my high school, and my grades, which, by the way, as you may have noticed, in the interview, I pointed out that the reason why I had to take a gap year, all West Indians had to take a gap year, because when I was growing up, our examination questions were set in Britain and sent down to the Caribbean. And we did it, and they were sent back to Britain to be marked there, and then the whole process took about 4 months. I still envy my students, sort of them realizing that they can get their exam results within a week. But it's what happened to me was that I just missed getting one of those two scholarships to be sent to Cambridge, because I would have been a very different person, as I've seen from the folks who came back home who went on these. But going to the University of the West Indies was a defining moment for me, because there I met other Caribbean people. And as you quite rightly pointed out, it was very much the first cosmopolitan experience. And there, by comparing our experiences with each other, we also were able to tackle better the problem of what do we make of this horrendous colonial experience, and how do we sort of come to terms with the transition that we were experiencing. We came to them together. And so you're absolutely right. It's as fundamental, and if you ask any Caribbean scholar who went to the University of the West Indies, that university was absolutely determining in terms of how we think about the world. And again, trying to work out how I'm going to approach my biography of C.L.R. James, one of the big differences we have is that he did not have that experience. And I'm using this as a kind of way of, okay, thank you very much. I have a tendency to go on too much, and I mean, so thanks. So thanks for those comments. I think you're absolutely right about this, and your reference to the specific and the universal in Caribbean thought is well taken, and our engagement with Western culture, which you emphasize, is excellent. Thinking about freedom, well, that is I'm very grateful for the comments made here. The fact that ideas emerge from certain contexts, from the bottom up. Yes, that's been central. And there are two people, however, I want to point out who are very helpful, two Westerners, in this task. I didn't know they influenced me until I looked back and realized that they must have been influential. And one is Aristotle, and the other is Hegel. Now, Hegel and myself have had a sort of very strange, complicated relationship. And I'm not quite sure still what to make of the fact that in a couple of weeks I'm going to Stuttgart to get the Hegel Prize. Clearly the Germans recognize this, but, Hegel is a very strange person to be influenced by. As you know, if you've read the sort of his philosophy of history, he was totally racist. Okay, complete. I mean, the section on Africa is just an abomination. So, but I take comfort whenever in the fact that W.B. Du Bois, in fact, was able to. I'm sure he read it. He was fluent in German, and still he was able to continue and see what is valuable in the work. Okay. And so did, of course, C.L.R. James, one of my heroes, who spent weeks, months on the logic. What I'm going to say is that many of the questions you posed, in fact, is there in Hegel and obviously influenced me. So that there is a dialectic between slavery and freedom. Well, the dialectic is not a static one. This sort of, it's a continuous process. So, no, there's no problem in that regard in terms of how freedom originating in the master-slave or the slavery-freedom dialectic, how are we to understand it today? It's been a continuous process of transformation. The dialectic isn't static. So that, we can talk more about that. But, it's what I'm still sort of working through. But the fact that ideas emerge from context was a very important one. And surprisingly, it's from Aristotle. I learned this because he has a fascinating theory of history on ideas, that these ideas, in fact, emerge from the ordinary people and are then sort of taken up by, the philosophers and others. And he didn't go as far as suggesting, but implicit in the view which Hegel picked up on was a dialectical view of the relation between ideas and structure. It's hard to see this in Aristotle, but that was part of where I got it, and that would be my answer to Alex. But no, I don't see a problem in the dialectic and the movement continuing in the modern world. You got to find other ways in which replaces slavery, perhaps. But sure, the subordination of women, you can see that dialectic emerging. I've got to, Alex's emphasis on immiseration, which I'll have to end on this point, but it's an important one for me. If you grew up in Jamaica, where the relics of slavery, both physical, archaeological, but also personal, social, are there in relationships, in the way in which parents treat their children. There are all sorts of different ways in male-female relationships, in the violence and so on. Never went away. So for me, the question was, the problem of immiseration involves, yes, the external oppression, and one has to sort of course, analyze all those structures and so on. But something weird has happened in America, in particular, where it's become verboten to look in any way at what oppression did to the oppressed. Funny enough, in my New Left days, my friends in Europe don't have a problem with this, but in America, because of all the, the different issues involved here, it's become a no-no, which is ridiculous. The fact that I'm a Jamaican, in fact, I keep telling people, makes it easy, because in Jamaica, there's not a problem. If you pick up the newspaper, almost every week, someone is writing about what slavery did to us. you know, the need to recognize this is not blaming the victim, which is this stupid sort of, cliched response to it. No, it's, liberation, emancipation involves recognizing, what happened to you, what happened to your ancestors, and the ways in which you do. And it's a form of agency to recognize, because you're saying you're the one who's going to emancipate yourself. So there's a lot more I could say. I find these reflections extremely perceptive, and I have a lot to think about. And I also have a lot to think about in terms of the book I'm writing now on C.L.R. James, in which I'm doing with him what you just did with me.
So now we have time for audience questions. So we're going to open it up, and you can ask questions to Orlando and to the panel.
Thank you all so much. My name is Peter Blair. I'm a professor here at Harvard in the Ed School. Professor Patterson, I resonated a lot with your own biography, having studied in the Caribbean before coming to the US. My question to you is, as you've switched these contexts, where, in a sense, like the salience of the historical oppression has been different, right? Like in Jamaica, you can identify with what happened there, and then you come to America as a Black person, where there's a conceptual identification, but like a different kind of like embodied visceral identification. What are some of the ways in which you've navigated the notions of freedom and oppression in these two different contexts? And what are some of those lessons from your own life for, say, the people of our generation in terms of how we can build solidarity across, Black people from the diaspora and Black folks in the US?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. I led a somewhat schizophrenic life, going between Jamaica and the U.S. because for a long time, of course, in Jamaica, I'm viewed as pretty radical, having been the advisor to a prime minister who was trying to start a revolution for 7 years. But it's the strangest experience, and for some of the points I touched on earlier, coming to America where bringing a quite open Caribbean view of what oppression is often gets me in trouble. It's just the strangest thing, sort of being told you're blaming the victim, you're not seeing the world the way we do. I think I'm hoping that it's abated somewhat, but I think we can both learn from each other, and I think especially I found it useful, my Caribbean experience, trying to understand the experience of Black people here, both the differences and the similarities. It's very valuable, and I don't think one should be intimidated by the very superficial kind of mistaken responses which you get as you try to understand what happened here in terms of what happened there and vice versa. Hopefully, a more cosmopolitan approach will emerge, and I keep constantly, as someone pointed out, complaining about the parochialism of American, not just sociology, but American politics. And that I hope that we will recognize, both what's similar and what's different in our experience of colonialism and neocolonialism. Interestingly, that's been done already, but in the popular culture, in the music. So the dialogue between Jamaican reggae, okay, and American, blues and which generated rap is the kind of understanding which I look forward to, and there's very little misunderstanding there, but there's a lot among intellectuals. So, yeah, we have a lot to learn from each other, and hopefully we'll get away from the kind of cliches which lead to these, you're blaming the victim with all this talk of immiseration, which is ridiculous.
So first off, thank you to everyone who hosted this event. I just graduated from undergrad in May, and I'm not in academia right now, so it's pretty incredible to me. Like, I studied sociology all throughout college, and I'm still like, I feel like a sociological baby, like I'm finding intellectual giants, like Professor Patterson all the time, and having my mind blown. And resonated with so much and could say so much, but I'll stick to my question. So I currently work in education, was also studying education studies. So Professor Patterson had this question for you, especially with your work in Jamaica on education. And in particular, I was resonating and reflecting on this idea about how do we make sense of the oppressed past using the oppressor's tools, and how does oppression affect the oppressed? And I think you come in with this really interesting entry point, external to the US. But when I think about the American education system, I think a lot about how it oppresses Americans. I think a lot about how the people who go through the education system come out without the critical awareness to think about what the system has done to them, not only the education system, but American society writ large. And it is just, to me, seems like this self-perpetuating cycle. And for someone who works in education, I work with districts thinking about resource allocation. To me, the future has to be in this shared vision in which we understand critically what is wrong with education, the ways in which American society is flawed structurally, so we can then think about a liberatory potential. But I see this self-perpetuating cycle that I'm just coming to grips with, both theoretically and practically, how I can contribute to helping to break it. So I'm curious, with your own experiences in education and kind of thoughts on freedom and oppression, what your thoughts on that would be.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you can begin by reading C.L.R. James, because you may not have heard about him, but he, as I said earlier, described himself as an Afro-Saxon, but he had no reservations whatsoever about the Western literature, Western thought, and so on, and how we can use it and grab it by the neck and use it for its own purpose. He says no, and this is the number one thing that bothers me, the fact that, the origins of certain ideas should be a way of judging them. You can't do that. I mean, as James pretty soon found out, if you did that, if you are to reject the ideas of all racists who have written, you're going to be rejecting 99% of some of the best ideas out there, right? I mean, even Marx, he had some pretty unpleasant ideas about, when his daughter took up with a Cuban. But anyway, what I'm saying is, it's a very naive situation we're still in, where we too strongly emphasize this sort of personal context of ideas in how we judge whether we're going to use them or not. You've got to begin with that, and I guess it was necessary at some point in the Black liberation movement and other forms of liberation movement to promote your own people and to demote the racists and so on. But I think we have to get to the point where we move beyond that and see ideas as ideas, and whether they're good, judge them in their own terms. I'm amazed that we still have this problem, quite frankly. But you just have to be courageous and sort of recognize that you're going to look for what best serves your purposes in the canon and move with it. And it takes some courage, but I mean, that's the only way to go. It's just completely a terrible situation which chauvinism sometimes gets us in. And you know, one of my books, which is not often cited, is called Ethnic Chauvinism, the Reactionary Impulse. And that book was all about what you asked me, right? I devoted an entire volume to coming to terms with just that issue, so you may want to look at it.
Thank you all so
Thanks
much.
for coming, Steve. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. I guess my question is about I'm doing a lot of research around Manley's democratic socialism in Jamaica right now, and thinking about his sort of liberatory practice in which he was like really thinking about self-sufficiency in Jamaica,
Yeah.
liberatory practices, thinking about the like more peasant communities, descendants of slaves, and so forth. That time saw like the people of Jamaica who hadn't really been recognized getting this sort of recognition.
Right.
And so I'm thinking about contemporary Jamaica and, you know, you're saying people are talking about their slave past, like in the newspaper, they're writing about it all the time. But when the US sort of got more involved in Jamaica, I feel as though this sort of relation was like mystified, like there wasn't really any. Like I think about my family now, and this sort of like empirical relation really feels like dispersed and like really mysterious. Do you think that there is a way for the like more impoverished folks in Jamaica to sort of feel a little bit more, how do you say, there is a lot, I feel like there is a lot of agency there, like people are working very hard constantly, but do you think that there is any potential for there to feel like this like possibility again in the way in which they might have during this time that Manley was like really trying to create something new within the country?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a complicated situation. Now, on the Manley, whom I work with, and I noticed one of the photographs in the book, you'll see me and Manley on the hustings as we announce one of our major programs in the heart of the ghettos. What happened on the Manley, we was more successful in cultural liberation, in fact. We recognized the Rastafarians. Before that, we used to, the police would grab them and cut off their dreadlocks. I mean, this is just pernicious. And we gave recognition. I remember sitting down discussing whether we should allow the Rastas to have time on the radio to sort of preach their gospel and so on. That was, plus also the fact that the elites got dead scared and thought that, and all fled to Canada and Miami. Was the opportunity opened up for black entrepreneurs to own land in significant amount. So a lot happened culturally. Unfortunately, as you know, the economic project was not very successful, and Jamaica went through a long period of negative growth, and the growth in impoverishment and has meant that there is a strong level of immiseration among the Jamaican masses, those who have left. Many have migrated. Okay, and in fact, so many migrated that one of the things keeping the society floating is the remittances. In fact, remittances is the single largest contributor to the Jamaican economy, more than the tourist industry, which is often cited. Well, what's not often mentioned in the tourist industry is that over almost 40% of what comes in goes back out to feed the tourists. So, but what this has done, we're in a very peculiar situation now where the system seems on the verge of collapsing socially and relationally. The violence is really terrible, and you know, that is heartbreaking. We have, in fact, we've gone up to the point now where we have the highest murder rate in the world. We've long had the highest rate of femicide, which is the murder of women. And that goes straight back to me, to the sort of slavery, okay? Slavery was, a form of mass rape. And so I'm afraid it's not gotten better. We had a period on the mainland in which it did seem to be moving in the right direction, but our economic failures led to a situation where the people in the ghettos, and here's the other thing. If you look at the Jamaican figures, you'll see something very strange. The macro data is wonderful. It's a bit like America. The macro data is wonderful. We have among the lowest unemployment rate among third world countries, something like under 5%. But people are still angry, violent. The part of the problem too is that we have a very high rate of people just not working. In fact, the low unemployment rate is largely a function of the fact that people have just withdrawn from the labor force. This is straight. They can do that because they're getting money from the folks abroad. So I'm afraid that I read the Gleaner every day and I get a little depressed. I got even more depressed than I was last week when I got the news on the elections. But I feel get that every day. The situation is grim right now. So that, and no one in Jamaica would deny that there's a huge problem of, immiseration, of, extreme sort of